You might think pirates spent most of their time shouting "R" and chasing treasure, but their biggest enemy wasn't rival navies or ghost ships, it was water. Yes, good old H2O, the one thing you'd expect to be the life of the party, turned out to be the ultimate villain aboard pirate vessels. Let me tell you something wild. For pirates in the golden age of piracy, roughly from the late 1600s to the early 1800s, water was often more dangerous than the broadside cannon blasts from a British man-of-war. And trust me, the way they tackled this problem ended up making their favorite drink, rum, safer than the stuff coming straight out of the sea. So buckle up, because the story of how pirates made alcohol safer than water to drink is filled with desperate measures, epic fails, and sneaky scientific accidents that predate modern chemistry by centuries. First off, let's talk about the real reason pirates couldn't just chuck a couple of barrels of water on deck and call it a day. Ships in those days, especially pirate sloops and frigates with about 50 crew members each, needed roughly 50 gallons of fresh water per day to keep everyone hydrated. Over several weeks at sea, that's thousands of gallons carried in barrels, which sounds fine until you realize water is heavy, hard to store properly, and once trapped in those wooden barrels, literally turns into a floating petri dish of bacteria and algae within 24 to 48 hours. The barrels were usually made from oak or pine, but they couldn't keep the water airtight or prevent contamination from salty sea air. Would rot, and worse, nasty little shipworms that liked nothing better than burrowing into the barrel staves. I mean, nothing says refreshing like tiny wiggly worms swimming in your drinking cup, right? Spoiler alert, it didn't work. The consequences? Well, first you got scurvy, a vitamin C deficiency made worse by the lack of fresh produce but definitely exacerbated by foul drinking water. Then came dysentery, cholera, and a bunch of stomach bugs with names you'd rather not hear on a Friday night. Let's just say it wasn't pretty. And it wasn't pretty for Captain Bartholomew Roberts in 1720, when his crew suffered so badly from contaminated water that nearly half the men were bedridden before a single cannon was fired. Pirates might have been fierce, but they were also terrifyingly vulnerable to something as simple as bad water. So what did they try? Believe me, some of the early attempts were almost comedic in their failure. One popular method was collecting rainwater by hanging barrels out on deck during storms, or simply trying to catch drips from the rigging. Sounds promising, right? Except that the barrels would often sit around for days before being used, collecting bird droppings, dead bugs, salt spray, and whatever else the ocean decided to toss on board. There's a famous story of a notorious pirate, Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, whose rainwater barrels at one point contained so many sea creatures that a historian described tiny crabs and unidentified slimy beasts being visible in the water. Because nothing says fearsome pirate like accidentally drinking what was basically a clown car of sea life. Bad idea. Really bad idea. Other crews tried boiling seawater to make it drinkable, which is where it gets really funny. On the one hand, boiling kills bacteria. Good, modern logic. On the other hand, boiling seawater just turns it into steam that's basically saltier than your average pretzel stick. So yes, technically the water was clean, but no one could drink it without their tongues turning into leather. That attempt was about as popular as walking the plank, and as effective too, about 0%. Pirates learned the hard way that you can't outsmart an ocean, at least not with a kettle and some firewood. Here's where it gets interesting. Ready for the plot twist? Pirates figured out something clever that made their standard seafaring booze, rum, and in some cases brandy, safer than their actual water supply. None of this was because they were master chemists. In fact, many probably had no idea why it worked. It just turned out that alcohol was a natural disinfectant. The 70% proof rum carried on ships killed most bacteria and discouraged the growth of nastier organisms. Compare this to stagnant, 24-hour-old water sloshing around in barrels that could contain 3.5% salt content and countless bacteria colonies multiplying like they were having a rave. And the alcohol starts to look like the trusty shipmate everyone wanted on their side. And trust me, the scale was massive. The infamous pirate ship Queen Anne's Revenge, captained by Blackbeard, reportedly carried upwards of 63-gallon barrels of rum on board, rationed out daily at about half a pint to each man. Not just because it was fun, but because it was one of the safest hydration options on the ship. Some captains took it even further, diluting the rum with a little water to make it last longer while still keeping it safer than pure water. It's basically their version of a water treatment plant, but with a lot more swagger and way less environmental responsibility. Now, mixing rum with a bit of water might sound like a summer cocktail special, but it wasn't exactly mixology. It was more like desperate survival tactics bundled with a touch of drunken pragmatism. The alcohol content just needed to be high enough to stop anything gross from growing in the liquid. Less than 50% proof, and you might as well be drinking yesterday's seawater. More than 70% proof, and it was closer to rocket fuel. A grim choice between safe but potentially face-melting rum or nasty but hydrating water. Pirates often just chose the safer path, and that's why the phrase proof literally comes from this era. They would prove the alcohol content by trying to light it on fire. If it burned, proof it passed. Otherwise, it was too watered down and potentially unsafe. But the story doesn't end there, because alcohol wasn't just safer. It was also a medicine chest in a bottle. Pirates used it to sanitize wounds, which was far better than anything else available on the high seas. And oddly enough, rum sometimes helped with digestion and even pain relief. Captain Henry Morgan's crew in the late 1600s famously used rum as an early form of anesthesia, combined with primitive dental work. Imagine getting your tooth yanked out by a man with a cutlass and a bottle of booze. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation. Still, pirates knew the limits. Rum alone wasn't a miracle cure or perfect hydration, so they supplemented it with other methods. One particularly bizarre practice was fermenting other things they could find, like coconuts or even molasses left behind by traders, to create low-proof, sour drinks that were less deadly than raw water. It wasn't great, but it worked well enough to spread out the supply of hard liquor. Think of it like the original mixology hacks born out of necessity rather than taste. What's more, pirates recognized the importance of rationing booze just as carefully as they did provisions. A healthy pirate might get just about half a pint per day, enough to stay buzzed, but not so much that he'd swim with the sharks voluntarily. And the barrels, those were precious commodities guarded fiercely, because losing a single 60-gallon cask of rum was like losing the ship's very soul. There's a hilarious account of Captain Mary Read's crew getting into a mutiny, not over treasure or freedom, but because the quartermaster hoarded the rum supply and tried to dilute it too much. Pretty desperate stuff for a bunch of hardened villains who could plunder a galleon, but apparently couldn't agree on how to make their drinks. Of course, this reliance on alcohol created some side effects. Pirate crews were notoriously intoxicated most of the time, which is both a recipe for chaos and oddly enough part of their strategy. A drunken crew was less likely to mutiny, for example, and more likely to follow orders when the captain shouted, "Drink up and fight." There's an old joke from the era that the difference between a pirate and a Navy man was mostly how hammered they were during battle. You can probably guess how that ended in some cases. So by turning to alcohol as a safer source of hydration, pirates were basically hacking the dangers of water pollution with 18th century ingenuity. They weren't just jolly swashbucklers. They were accidental public health pioneers. It's the 18th century precursor to modern water purification, distilled down to barrels of rum and a lot of questionable decisions. Next time you raise a glass of whiskey, just remember you're tipping your hat to some scurvy, worm-swilling, cannon-firing geniuses who figured out that sometimes the best way to survive at sea was to drink the harder stuff. Alright, so we've established pirates hated water almost as much as a kraken hates a ship's hull, and turned to rum like it was liquid gold. Which, by the way, it practically was. But how exactly did this drunken genius keep their booze safe, their wounds clean, and sometimes even stave off death itself? Here's where the story gets both sticky and strangely impressive. Pirates weren't just swigging and stumbling. They became cruising chemists in their own right, and rum was their best tool. Let's pick up where we left off. Those barrels of rum weren't just for partying or swagger. They doubled as the crew's first line of defense against things that go bump in the sea. Remember, the average pirate crew was about 50 men, each needing roughly half a pint of rum daily, sometimes diluted with a splash of questionable water to stretch the supply, but still keep that bacterial party suppressed. The alcohol content in their rum usually hovered around 70% proof, enough to stun bacteria, if not the drinker. It wasn't drink till you drop, so much as sip or die in their minds. But that wasn't just a myth. The way they tested proof was pretty hardcore too. If you poured the rum onto a wick and it lit with a steady flame, it was proof enough to keep you alive. If it fizzle-popped or just didn't catch, spoiler alert, it was way too watered down and probably harboring more germs than the heads. That's pirate speak for toilets. So this little fiery test doubled as both quality control and an impromptu bar trick. Pretty hardcore. Now you might think this means pirates were just walking alcoholics who happened to survive, right? Not quite. They actually used their favorite drink for more than just avoiding bacteria from drinking water. When a pirate got sliced open by a cutlass or caught by cannon shrapnel, the standard medical care was to pour rum directly into the wound. Yep, no sterile saline solution or clean bandages, just gallons of hard liquor, which worked surprisingly well as an antiseptic. In fact, it was about 70% effective at killing off many types of bacteria that could cause infections, which in the murky world of 1700s medicine was a good bet. Loose cannon wounds were common, and with no hospitals for hundreds of miles except for some rat-infested ports, rum was the ship's emergency room medicine chest. I mean, imagine getting stitched up or having a bullet pulled out with a bottle of rum propping you up. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation if your last memory is slurring. Arg, that burns worse than the cannonball. But the truth is, pirates probably owed their survival to enough grog and rum first aid more times than proper surgery. They also discovered something else pretty genius, and this one's all about fermentation science, even if they didn't know the term. Ships often had to deal not just with spoiled water but rotten food, especially fruit and vegetable, which were nearly impossible to keep fresh on long voyages. Pirates learned that fermenting molasses, the sticky, syrupy byproduct from sugar cane processing, into rum wasn't just about taste or getting drunk. The fermentation process made it easier to store calories safely. Molasses is actually pretty high in minerals and residual sugars, and fermenting it reduces harmful elements by converting them into alcohol, which preserved it longer than any salted pork or stale hardtack. You see, they were basically using microbial magic, turning potential food poison into a source of both nutrition and hydration. Think of it as the original kombucha, but with more barrels and way less hipster vibe. Also, pirates didn't just drink rum straight. They mixed it with whatever failed attempts at water they could salvage. Remember those rain barrels full of crab confetti and slimy sea beasts? Pirates started mixing those murky waters with their rum, figuring that the booze's disinfectant power would keep things safe enough to drink. This was the predecessor of modern water purification. Only their filter was alcohol, and their quality control was a nervous gag reflex. So, rum wasn't just a morale booster or a weapon against enemy fleets. It was literally their version of a water treatment plant. Not exactly EPA certified, but in the 1700s, it was the best system under the sun or clouds over the ocean. Another fascinating tidbit comes from the legendary pirate Anne Bonny and her compatriots. Pirates often had to ration their rum carefully, because losing even a single barrel meant a mutiny-worthy disaster. Anne Bonny's crew once nearly tore the ship apart, because their quartermaster tried to stretch the rum supply by watering it down too much. Talk about a flash mob of pissed-off, semi-drunk pirates. Since rum was a vital part of their daily survival, treating it like a treasure was second nature. These barrels were guarded like treasure chests, except instead of gold doubloons, you got a precious fluid that could kill bacteria and dull pain, the ultimate double agent in pirate life. Now, if you're thinking pirates just drank their way through the plague of contaminated water, the story isn't done yet. There were other clever water-related hacks that, while maybe not as glamorous as rum, kept them alive. For instance, some pirate ships would salt their water supply lightly, which sounds dumb at first. Salt plus salty sea might equal extra gross, right? But adding a tiny fraction of salt slowed down some bacterial growth and made the water less hospitable to marine organisms that loved freshwater. It wasn't a perfect fix, more like a desperate tweak to a terrible system. Plus, pirates sometimes dipped into their food stores, like preserved salted meats and dried fruits, to get some minimal hydration and vitamin C. Nothing fancy, more like scavenging vitamin supplements to dodge scurvy and stomach rot. Speaking of scurvy, here's the kicker. No matter how much rum or rationed water they had, without fresh fruit or vegetables, vitamin C deficiency stayed the biggest health hazard. Pirates tried to fix that with hunting fresh game on islands or trading with locals, but it was rare luck. Rum didn't help fight scurvy. It probably made it worse, but it did sell the illusion of medicine and survival to cranky crews craving hope and vodka in one. Captain Cook's voyages later showed that citrus fruits were the real anti-scorbutic heroes, but pirates had to rely on what they had: barrels of booze and DIY hygiene hacks. So in a way, their alcoholic arsenal was less a cure and more a survival tactic that bought time, letting them chase more treasure before sickness took hold. Now, before you picture pirates as just ocean drunks bobbing under their sails, remember that managing these ration systems took a surprising amount of discipline. Quartermasters kept detailed logs of who got what slice of rum and water daily. Too much booze and the crew was useless in battle. Too little and morale tanked faster than a ship with a cannon hole in its hull. The best captains were part drill sergeant, part bartender, knowing exactly when to dole out a shot and when to make the men swing cutlasses instead of bottles. This delicate balance probably gave pirates a tactical edge over Navy crews strictly on water rations. They were just as dangerous, more hammered, as they were hungry or thirsty. There's a reason why naval officers worried about pirates. They weren't just drunk lunatics. They were lethally buzzed sailors with rum-powered determination. And here's a little irony for you. The very people who ironically saved their lives through alcohol also helped inspire future innovations in water safety. Their crude proofing method with fire sparked the idea of testing alcohol concentration in spirits, which missionaries and merchants eventually refined into modern distillation standards. The concept of using alcohol as a disinfectant. Science caught up centuries later with antiseptics and sanitizers, but pirates were doing this with barrels and bravado. In a weird way, their pirate party fueled a scientific revolution in water and health hygiene, though nobody at the East India Company was raising a toast to that. So what's the final takeaway here? Pirates had a problem that many sailors before and long after faced: how to stay hydrated and healthy when the easiest source of water was basically a floating soup of nasty microbes and ocean detritus. They failed a lot. Oh boy, did they fail. By drinking rainwater with crab carcasses, boiling salt into undrinkable steam, and suffering from scurvy until they could barely keep a cutlass upright. But the real genius: they turned what could have been shipwreck-level disaster into a manageable, even survivable form by choosing rum as their quasi-medical water source. That 63-gallon barrel of rum aboard Queen Anne's Revenge wasn't just for show. It was the ship's lifeblood, more reliable than stagnant water and more effective than any attempts to purify seawater with fire and spit. Next time you crack open a bottle of whiskey or rum, give a little nod to those scrappy, scurvy-ridden, cannon-firing pirates who figured out, accidentally but effectively, that sometimes the best water is the one that burns just enough to stop bugs dying in it.